All right, we are going to start going over some key points of chapters 1 through 17 of Same Kind of Different as Me. The first 17 chapters, there's not a lot of interaction between Ron and Denver because at this point they really haven't met. There's a lot of kind of backstory for each of these guys, and so you find out a lot about who they are and where they come from, and kind of what circumstances have brought them to the place that they will be when they meet each other. So we're going to start by going over the discussion questions that I gave you guys. The first one was, what kind of person is Ron Hall? And I think more specifically, how would you describe him? But also how he describes himself. One thing I really admire about Ron is that he's pretty honest about himself. He doesn't hold back the embarrassing details about his life and who he is. And he kind of owns his mistakes. So I really like that about him. But let's go ahead and take a look at kind of maybe how we would view him, and also how he actually describes himself. So I think that he would describe himself in certain places as flashy, and that he enjoys his wealth and he thinks that his money will buy him status and happiness, especially at this point in the book. I love that story where Ron calls his wife over the phone and he says, "You're not going to believe what I just traded for, a $160,000 fire engine red Corniche convertible with white leather interior." And he's so excited to tell his wife about this. And the funny thing is, Deborah is the complete opposite. She said that she would be embarrassed to be seen in a car like that. She says, "Don't even drive it out of the showroom." So Ron is very pleased with his level of success that he's attained, and he's not afraid to show it off. Whereas Deborah, I don't think that their level of success was quite as big of a deal to her. I think that she would have been perfectly happy, middle class or as wealthy as they are. And so I think it's kind of interesting. Another good story about that is where he was talking about how he kind of viewed giving and donating to those less fortunate. And so he said on page 65, "I often donated $5,000 paintings or hefty gift certificates, hoping to lure wealthy bidders to my gallery. We attended black-tie charity balls, got our picture in the paper, raising champagne glasses under starry lights." So notice when he is talking about like giving, it says he was attending these black-tie charity balls in order hoping to lure wealthy bidders to my gallery, right? So it was all about kind of his image and puffing up his own image when it came to kind of donating and giving to others. Once again, Deborah is the total opposite, and I love her take on this. She talks about how, I would have spent this much money on the actual ticket, which is actually going towards the caterers and the decorations and all that. I would have spent this much money on her dress. And so then on page 65, she replies to him, "Well, why don't we just send in a check for $4,000 and stay home? The charity would actually make more money that way." And she's right. If 3,000 of the $4,000 is going towards, or if most of the money is going towards the event itself and not necessarily the actual charity, she's right. Right? So she kind of sees things more practically, and she's like, well, is this really helping people, or who is this helping? And I think that brings us to a really important question about philanthropy. Philanthropy is it kind of is defined as kind of what your generosity, your charitable giving. Okay, and I think most people, when they think of philanthropy, they think of money donations. But philanthropy is really just your charitable giving. And so the question then is all philanthropy the same? And so I think there are benefits to all, and I'm not going to answer all these questions for you. These are questions for you to really think about. But think about donating money versus donating time, versus, donating efforts or donating goods or whatever it is. Is it all the same, or is one better than the other? The second question there is, are there effective and ineffective ways to give? And I think just based on what I was talking about here, Ron's kind of motivation for giving was to puff himself up, to lure wealthy bidders to his gallery, whereas Deborah's was just about like, hey, who is this going to actually help? And so I don't know, maybe that's a good question for you to consider as well. Like, does motivation matter? Does motive matter? And are there better and more effective ways to give? Okay. So again, I'm not going to answer those questions for you, but those are questions you should be thinking about as you read this. Some more about Ron Hall. He has kind of a sense of superiority, and you see that in a couple ways. On page 8, he describes, or he actually says on page 7, how God had blessed him with an eye for art and an eye for making money. But he doesn't necessarily always acknowledge that God is the one that has blessed him with that. Instead, he says, to my way of thinking, I'd bootstrapped my way from lower middle class country boy into the rarefied atmosphere that oxygenates the lifestyles of the Forbes 400. So again, he's really proud of himself, and he feels like he has accomplished quite a bit, and so there's lots to be proud of. And I don't mean to take anything away from that. He accomplished quite a bit, and he did quite a bit with his life. But it's just, that's the way he viewed himself, right? That he was this kind of, money-making warrior. And then on page 10, it talks about that incident where there was a homeless man who walked into his art showroom and then ended up taking things from him, from his store. And then he says this incident firmly fixed my image of homeless people as a ragtag army of ants bent on ruining decent people's picnics. And so there's a kind of an interesting metaphor there, especially since when it comes to picnics, ants are typically the destroyers, right? They're the ones that kind of ruin things. And so he looks down upon those that have less because he feels like they're just trying to tear down my own kind of wealthy kind, if that makes sense, and take away from me and what I've accomplished. Okay, so next one, why does Ron agree to volunteer at the homeless shelter, and what was his initial reaction to doing so? Well, let's talk first about why he agrees to volunteer at the homeless shelter, and it really was out of a desire to please his outrageously forgiving wife and to show devotion to her. So I'm sure probably one of the moments that sticks out in your heads from chapters 1 through 17 is when we find out that Ron had an affair with another woman. And then that kind of scene where where he confronts Deborah about it and tells her about it. And then after that, we know that they are able to kind of reconcile, and I think for a little while he was pretty much going to do whatever she wanted him to do. On page 69 it says, it was a gracious offer considering that I and not Deborah had been the traitor. Faster than you can say divorce court, I said yes. So I think at that point, after Deborah had forgiven Ron for his infidelity, I think he was pretty willing to please her, and so she wanted to work at the mission. By the way, that is a picture of the Union Gospel Mission that they're referring to, and so yeah, I think he was pretty ready to appease her in any way. Speaking of the affair, I think some interesting questions should be considered, especially when it comes to forgiveness. And again, I'm not going to answer these questions for you, but there are some questions that you should think about when you're reading this book. Though the Bible calls for people to practice forgiveness, pure and sincere forgiveness is not that easy. Deborah, by the way, made it look very easy. It's not. And the interesting thing is, forgiveness is not easy to give or to receive. A lot of times forgiveness can be really, really hard to accept. Okay? So then think about, too, what is the relationship between the forgiver and the forgiven? Is there supposed to be a two-way street there? The person that forgives, should they then be able to expect something from the forgiven person that they forgave? And then what is the relationship between forgiveness and personal responsibility? Like I said, if you have been forgiven, is there something that you should be held accountable to? So that's an interesting question to think about. Let's talk about Deborah and the affair. Her first initial reaction on page 68 is she was throwing things at him, right? She was upset. It said, shoes, vases, and figurines flew through the air. She pounded me with bare fists. And I think most people are like, yeah, that might be an acceptable reaction. She was not happy about it. But then she did something really, really interesting that I think most of us would be extremely shocked by. She called the other woman, and she didn't call the other woman to yell at her or to express frustration. She said this on pages 68 to 69. She says, I don't blame you for the affair with my husband. I know that I've not been the kind of wife Ron needed, and I take responsibility for that. I forgive you. I hope you find someone who will not only truly love you, but honor you. So a couple things. I think for some of us women out there, that might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable because she essentially took the blame for her husband's infidelity. And I think a lot of us modern or postmodern women in particular, we get a little uncomfortable when a woman takes the blame for the husband's wrongdoing, right? And then does that make her look like a pushover? Does that make her look weak? Does that make her seem like she doesn't stand up for herself? And so that's a question you can maybe answer yourself in your own head. But I do think that in some ways, I know that, okay, ironically, because most of us would think that that makes her look weak, I think that demonstrates an incredible amount of strength to be able to say, you know, I had a part in this too. And she's not the one that cheated. She's not the one that officially broke their marital vows. But man, there's a whole string of events, I'm sure, that led up to them feeling distant from one another, and I think she's just owning that piece of it, and I think that takes incredible strength. I think it takes incredible integrity, and so she's quite a really interesting woman. And the thing I really like about what she said to the other woman is she didn't just stop at "I forgive you," because we can kind of forgive and move on and still maybe hold a little bit of bitterness in our hearts. But she goes further and she says, not only do I forgive you, I hope you find someone who will not only truly love you, but honor you. And so she actually has good intentions for this woman. And could you imagine how difficult that is in that moment? Man, she's a woman of grace. Then, after calling the other woman, she talks to Ron and she says, hey, you and I are now going to rewrite the future history of our marriage. And so I love that. She takes charge and says, no, this isn't a divorce moment. I'm not going to allow this to be a divorce moment. We are going to do our marriage differently. We're going to move forward, and we're going to leave this in the past, because she says, I forgive you. And I promise I will never bring this up ever again. I find that interesting too, because it's one thing to say that I forgive you, but as you guys probably are aware, in relationships, 30 days after this happens, if Ron were to do something or say something a little bit snarky, she could totally throw this back in his face and be like, well, I'm not the one that cheated, right? But she says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to bring this up ever again. And again, I think that just takes an incredible amount of grace and love and mercy. And it's just kind of incredible that she would do that. Because again, she would have every right to throw this back in his face. But I think she knows that that's not true forgiveness, and that wouldn't actually be beneficial to their marriage. So, wow, big time wow on that. The other part is, what is his initial reaction to agreeing to volunteering at the homeless shelter? He says it on page 75. He really hopes that Deborah will hate it. He said, secretly, I hoped that once she actually rubbed shoulders with the kind of scuzzy derelicts that had robbed my gallery, Deborah would find it too scary, too real to volunteer on East Lancaster. Then we could revert to doing our part by dropping off some old clothes or furniture, or, if she really found it tough to tear herself away, more money. So again, his kind of motivation for doing this is solely to please his wife, but he's secretly kind of hoping that she will hate it too, so that they can go back to kind of the easy form of philanthropy where we just donate stuff, because for the wealthy, that is easy, right? Donating money, donating stuff. Yeah, they could do that. What is very, very hard for Ron is to separate kind of his image from what he's actually doing there. Okay, let's start talking about Denver Moore a little bit. So the first question you're supposed to answer is, talk about the direction of Denver Moore's life. What events have landed him in the shelter? Man, he's had a really interesting life, and so let's talk about a few of them. So first of all, the first thing he talks about is that he was a sharecropper on a cotton plantation in Red River Parish, Louisiana. On page 3, it says he was like a slave, even though slavery had supposedly ended when his grandma was just a girl. I had a shack I didn't own, 2 pairs of overalls I got on credit, a hog, and an outhouse. I worked them fields, planting and plowing and picking and giving all the cotton to the man that owned the land, all without no paycheck. I didn't even know what a paycheck was. Okay, so it is interesting. This was the modern day form of slavery, and this is really, really common practice in the South. He describes sharecropping a little bit more in later pages, and so let's go ahead and look at that because I think it's important to understand kind of how hopeless and helpless a sharecropper was. So I'm going to have a few slides where he describes that. He says the man owned the land. Then he give you the cotton seeds and the fertilizer and the mule and some clothes and everything else you need to get through the year. Except he don't really give it to you. He let you buy it at the store on credit. But it was his store on his plantation that he owned. You plowed and planted and tended till picking time. Then at the end of the year, when you bring in the cotton, you go to the man and settle up. Supposedly, you're going to split that cotton right down the middle, or maybe 60-40. But by the time the crop comes in, you owe the man so much on credit, your share of the crop gets eat up. And even if you don't think you owe that much, or even if the crop was especially good that year, the man weighs the cotton and writes down the figures, and the only one that can read, and he's the only one that can read the scale or the book. Doesn't really seem like a fair situation there. So you done worked all year, and the man ain't done nothing, but you still owe the man. And wasn't nothing you can do but work his land for another year to pay off that debt. What it come down to was the man didn't just own the land, he owned you. Okay, so this was the kind of situation that he was brought up in. He was brought up in a situation where he was completely helpless. There was really no way out. You couldn't really get ahead in life, okay, in this situation. Also, Denver Moore, another detail about him that I think is significant when it comes to kind of the path that he was on, everyone close to him dies. On page 47, he said, I couldn't figure out why God kept taking all the folks I loved the most. And if you look through the list, I mean, we've got Big Mama, his grandmother, who dies on page 17 from the house fire. Chook, who's his cousin, and it kind of seems like Chook actually started that fire, and it almost seems like he did so on purpose because he did nothing in order to save himself from that fire, so it was really kind of bizarre. Then there was BB, his biological father, who he doesn't even know, he either walked out on him or he was actually murdered by the husband of a woman he was sleeping with from church, which I think is so interesting because you can imagine how that really kind of colors his view of church and church people, right? There was Uncle James, who got sick and died, Aunt Etha, I'm not sure, who moved away. And then there was even Thurman, his brother who he had been growing up with. They got split up. And so everybody he had as family was kind of gone in some form or fashion, whether it was walking out or actually dying. And so that can really mess a person up in a lot of ways. And then, of course, the story of him being dragged, literally dragged, for helping a white woman. That would certainly color his opinion of white people, and it would certainly, understandably, lead him to have a fear of, like he says, a fear of talking with white women, and probably just a fear of white people within positions of authority, right? On page 50, he says, looking back, I figure what them boys done caused me to get a little throwed off in life. Yeah, duh. I mean, come on. Like, are you serious? It's a horrible, horrible, traumatic thing to happen to. And for sure, I wasn't going to be offering no help to white ladies no more. Okay, and I think that particular situation really closed him off emotionally, which, again, understandably so, but I think it did close him off emotionally in a lot of ways, and I think he probably had a hard time trusting people in general, in particular white people. And then this is so interesting to me. He was literally left in the dark. The second one on page 64 says, I was still living by coal oil lamp in a shotgun shack with no running water. Okay, this was like in the 1960s. We had electricity, but he was still living without any running water, without any electricity. So he was literally left in the dark. What happened to me was I got real discouraged. Felt like I wasn't good for nobody, wasn't never going to be able to do no better. And then he was also figuratively left in the dark. He was not told about opportunities that were like not far from him. It says, it got to be the 1960s. All them years I worked for them plantations, the man didn't tell me that there was colored schools I could have gone to, or that I could have learned a trade. He didn't tell me I could have joined the army and worked my way up, earned some money of my own and some respect. I didn't know about World War II, the war in Korea, or the one in Vietnam. That's how removed he was from reality and from life, and he was kept in the dark. And I didn't know colored folks had been rising up all around Louisiana for years, demanding better treatment. He's talking about the civil rights movement. He was in the middle of the South where the civil rights movement was a huge deal, and he had no idea what was going on. He didn't know about World War II, the war in Korea, the one in Vietnam. Man, the amount of information that he was deprived of, right? And then the fact that he didn't even know he could go to school. He didn't know that he could learn a trade. He didn't even know he could join the army. That's how left in the dark he was. And I think that's really significant. I think that education is a powerful tool. I think that what you know leads to more opportunities, and how you know what you know leads to more opportunities. And so the fact that he wasn't even given the chance to know left him with really, really limited options. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us, by the way, to not take our education for granted. Okay, so he ended up going to the big city for a chance at a different life, but was not even close to adequately prepared. On pages 3 and 4, he says, so I walked out to Highway 1, waited for that train to slow down some, and jumped on it. I didn't get off till Fort Worth, Texas. Now, when a black man who can't read, can't write, can't figure, meaning do math and things like that, and don't know how to work nothing but cotton comes to the big city, he don't have too many of what white folks call career opportunities. And that's how come I wound up sleeping on the streets. So again, opportunity matters, right? He did try, and unfortunately he failed. On page 70, he says, I tried to find work here and there, odd jobs, that kind of thing, but I learned pretty quick there wasn't much call for cotton farmers in the city. So again, education is a powerful thing, and he didn't have any. Okay. He often got in trouble with the law. He said on page 70, me and the law didn't get along too well out there. Seemed like I was always in trouble for something or other. And I think that's important because the relationship between homeless people and police officers can be a little bit difficult. I think most police officers, I think they're aware that the situations are difficult and sad for homeless people, but at the same time, they also have a responsibility to the taxpayers and to the people that pay their salaries in order to keep the streets clean, safe, and kind of healthy. And so there's a complicated relationship between police and homeless people, and I think a lot of times homeless people do not mix well with the law. Okay. He ended up going to prison, and that was for armed robbery, but he did a couple other things as well that were kind of scary. He says on page 77, you get a spirit in you. A spirit makes you feel like nobody in the world cares nothing about you. Don't matter if you live or die. Sorry for the typo. People with that spirit get mean, dangerous. And then once he was in prison, he turned even more violent. On page 79, it said, for the first few years I was there, at least 40 men got stabbed to death, and another bunch, hundreds of them, got cut up bad. I did what I had to do to protect myself. Okay, so he kind of learned violence. There's his education, right? He learned violence in prison, unfortunately. This leads me to a question related to homelessness. How does homelessness alter the basic human dignity of a person? So instead of thinking about what did they do in order to put themselves in a position that made them homeless, a question we should be considering is, how has homelessness, how has their condition affected who they are and what they believe about themselves? Okay. An interesting couple of examples here. First was the hamburger drop. You guys remember the story about how he was, it said on page 71, I'd pretend like I was digging in the trash. He'd actually had a hamburger, ate part of it, and then he would pretend to dig it out of the trash to make people feel sorry for him. And again, think about what that does to your sense of dignity, right? That he had to pretend like he was digging in the trash to make people feel sorry for him, right? And then on page 72, he talks about how he was actually showering in a public water fountain, and they would pretend like they were being silly and kind of like tourists and jumping in water fountains to be silly. And he says, we'd laugh and laugh while we was in that water, but it wasn't no fun. We was like animals living in the woods just trying to survive. So again, doing what they have to do may alter the way they feel about themselves and kind of reduce their sense of self-worth. And then again, what led him to the actual shelter? He finally gave in to some kindness, but notice that he only gives in to the kindness in exchange for work. On page 80, it says, Mr. Scheisler, I'm not sure. The manager of the mission told me over and over I didn't need to be sleeping outside in the weather. So he was trying to offer him a place to stay. But after some years went by, I let him give me a bed, and he let me clean up around the mission for my keep. Notice he would not accept that unconditionally. Okay. The next question says, discuss the differences between his life and Ron's life. Okay, so let's start with just a few points of comparison here. So starting with Denver, remember he opens up with his embarrassing story about being dragged, which is really, really significant, and it's really a traumatic experience. Ron also opens up with an embarrassing story. His is a little less traumatic. His embarrassing story had to do with how he had to carry his cup of pee to school, and then he ended up on timeout and had to stick his nose in a circle up against the wall. So comparing these two embarrassing stories, I think we can agree Denver's was a bit worse. Okay. Another point of comparison, Denver didn't even know that school was an option, versus Ron went to school. He talked about it, and he didn't just go to primary school. He went to college as well, and so he was formally educated. And I think that's a big point of difference there in their lives. Denver was dirt poor. He essentially owned nothing. Okay, and so there's Ron, who was lower middle class. He was not rich, and I think that's important to understand. His background, he was not rich growing up, but he got by, versus Denver, who literally had nothing. Okay, couldn't really say that he owned anything until, what was it, that one guy bought him a bike, but he had to work for that too. I mean, it was, anyway. Okay, so we've got dirt poor versus lower middle class. Again, Ron was not rich, but certainly had a few dollars on Denver. Denver worked on sharecropping land that was owned by the man, and interestingly enough, Ron, his family actually owned farmland, and he essentially was the man. Okay, he had black people in particular that worked for, or his family had black people that worked for the farm, and there were moments when Ron felt uncomfortable, and he talks about that. But there's a big difference then between being the worker and being the owner. Right? Ron's family was not necessarily cruel. I mean, I guess you could argue a little bit, but they weren't necessarily the worst of the worst. But still, there's a huge difference in having a sense of ownership. Denver, his family was made of different pieces, and they all eventually left him in some form or fashion. Ron had a consistent family that supported him. I love that story about his mom who tried to make him an outfit, and it was just not right. But it's still, I mean, it was sweet. His mom was trying. And so he had kind of consistent family that he could turn to, and he could fall back on for support. Denver took a huge risk by jumping on a train, and it did not work out for him. Okay, Ron took a huge risk on his first art deal, and it totally paid off. Right, he ended up becoming very, very wealthy, as a result of his career. Right. Interesting point here too. Both of them are somewhat miserable at this point. Denver, he talks about, oh gosh, sorry for the typo, but he drinks away the sorrow. He talks about how it's just drinking is not necessarily bad for a homeless person. It's something that helps them feel less pain, right? And then Ron, we know that he's kind of miserable too, because he turns to another woman outside of his marriage, and he tries to find fulfillment in money. Okay, so some interesting points of comparison there between the two. Okay, and what I think these points of comparison really lead us to are these questions of our just rewards. Okay, part of the American dream is faith in the rewards of hard work and self-reliance. Like if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything. So the question for us to consider is, how does Same Kind of Different as Me address that ideal? Okay, because if you go back and look at those points of comparison, clearly, okay, Ron had some advantages over Denver, right? The schooling, the fact that he was not dirt poor but lower middle class, his family owned property, he had consistent family that supported him, and his huge risk actually worked for him. It just paid off, and that wasn't necessarily anything spectacular that Ron did. It was all by chance. And so you look at kind of like, what is this idea of who, the American dream, is it possible for everybody? Just because Denver didn't necessarily achieve the traditional American dream, does that mean he didn't work hard? Of course not, right? Of course that's not what that means. And so I think that Same Kind of Different as Me, this book is kind of talking about that, like, look, we have to acknowledge our privilege. We have to acknowledge the fact that some of us start with advantages, okay? Does that mean Ron doesn't deserve his success? No, okay? Ron still worked hard, okay? But we still have to acknowledge that that maybe he still did have some advantages over other people, right? And then the last part says, by contrast, what is a common view of how homeless people come to their abject condition? Remember, a lot of people look at homeless people and they say, wonder what they did in order to put themselves in that situation. But in Denver's kind of storyline, it's not necessarily, wow, he's so bad and he just couldn't hang. And there was just piece after piece that was kind of beating him down and making him feel helpless and hopeless. And I think feeling hopeless and feeling helpless is really important in your own sense of self, in your sense of dignity, in your sense of worth, and in your sense of like, can I do this? Okay, and I think in a lot of ways he was beaten down. And so, again, these are just some questions for you to consider, but that's all I have for you for chapters 1 through 17.